So thank you everyone for attending this webinar today. So we'll get right into it. So first I'd like to cover with you some of the methods and limits of this particular environmental scan on which the webinar is based. So as Lise explained, it's based on the environmental scan that was performed by a subgroup of the Open Education Working Group. And we started by creating a list of all institutions that would be included in the scan. Then we developed a spreadsheet to collect the information for each institution. So the kind of information that was gathered was included examples of OER activities, but also the type of governance around those activities, the funding provided, as well as the services that were provided. For example, education around OER, about how to find OER, adapting them, any kind of editorial support, support with licensing or using technology. As for technology itself, we were looking for information about if the institution had an authoring platform, for example, Pressbooks, and a repository where OERs could be deposited, and also examples of success stories. So our main source of information were the institutional and organizational websites. So we looked at these for each institution and organization. Of course, there are limits to this because some content is temporary. Events, calls for proposals for grants can disappear, be taken down after it's over. So things disappear. Some initiatives actually don't make it online because they're not available publicly yet. And so we probably have missed some initiatives and some activities out there, and that may not be reflected fully in the webinar, but also in the scan. When we had contacts for individuals, we also there was some follow-up with these people to get more information or to confirm information. We also use the BC Campus Open Education Post-Secondary Directory, which is a great source of information. It covers BC, but also the rest of Canada, and it's updated regularly. So if you haven't actually had a look at this resource before, I highly recommend it. And we also performed a literature review specifically about OER in Canadian post-secondary institutions. So the scan included some mostly public institutions, but also some private post-secondary institutions. So we covered universities, colleges, CEGEP, and also some provincial and regional organizations that are involved in OER in some way. And it's probably also important to specify what we mean by activities and initiatives. So by activities, we mean services surrounding OER. Either they're provided upon demand or they're part of a guide or a website. And in terms of initiatives, what we mean is instances where OER have been created or adapted. And the data for this, for the environmental scan was collected between June and December 2019. So what we're presenting today is very much a condensed version of the environmental scan with selected examples. There will be a more detailed report that's based on the scan that will be made available in the next few months, and it will include relevant links as well. As I mentioned earlier, this webinar and the report are very much snapshots of a moment in time. So there are activities and initiatives in the works that did not make it into the report or this webinar because they're not official or public yet at the time that we collected the data. So should we have missed something big or you have any recent developments about OER that in your institution that you'd like to share, you're welcome to do so during the question period at the end or adding them to the chat box. So what you should see now is a map of Canada that includes the location of OER related activities or institutions where there are OER related activities. So the environmental scan covered 250 post-secondary institutions, so colleges, cégep, universities, polytechnical institutes, and as I said, public and private institutions. Of all those, of over those 250 institutions, just under 90, so 90, were found to mention any sort of OER related activities or initiatives on their website. And that was our main source of information. So we have organized the results of the environmental scan around 6 regions or themes that are reflected on the map. We have the Atlantic region, we have Quebec and Francophone institutions outside of Quebec, Ontario, the prairies, British Columbia, and northern or Indigenous institutions. So institutions that are either located in the territories or identified as Indigenous institutions. So in terms of general trends, in terms of OER participation rates, and by participation here, I mean any kind of activity or initiative that's related to OER, ranging from providing information to actually creating OER. So in terms of participation rates, what we found was that British Columbia had the highest percentage of institutions that are participating in OER, so 63%. Northern and Indigenous institutions had the lowest percentage of or participation rate with 9%. In terms of language, so institutions with English as the primary language of instruction were more likely to be involved in OER activities, about 40% of them. Compared to French language, institutions where French is the primary language of instruction, that was about 15%. And in terms of making information available on their websites, universities were more likely to have, to discuss OER on their websites. So that was about, oh, sorry, there's a typo. It's about 60% of them versus colleges and cégep, which were 20%. But there are definitely colleges that are collaborating with universities or adapting university-led initiatives, or also, especially in Quebec, they tend to work as part of consortium. And for example, also in colleges in Ontario have collaborated on a toolkit. So it's not as much, for colleges, it seems to be that it's not as much institution-based as working with, collaborating with other institutions. In terms of the most common OER activity, we found that having a LibGuide or a web page with information about OER was the most common way that an institution was involved in some way with OER. So at the very least, those pages explain what OERs are and also suggest sources for OER. And in terms of the research that's being conducted in Canada about the impact of OER, it's been found that British Columbia is leading the way with that kind of research. And specifically, among the institutions and organizations that are most active in OER research, there's Kwantlen, UBC, Thompson Rivers, and BC Campus. And then elsewhere outside of British Columbia, there's also Athabasca, Mount Royal, University of Saskatchewan, and eCampus Ontario. So in terms of open education working groups, we found that there are a number of them. So we're talking about working groups that are campus-wide, and they focus on OER or open education and or affordable course materials. So we found that 16 institutions have those kinds of working groups at the time that the environmental scan was performed. British Columbia leads the way with 10 institutions, followed by Ontario with 5. 11 of these institutions out of the 16 are actually universities. And 3 of these working groups focus on open and affordable course content. In general, it was found that these working groups are composed of librarians, teaching and learning center staff, student union representatives, faculty members who are often champions who already implement open in their classrooms, bookstore representatives, technology professionals, and administrators. Of the institutions that we looked at, a number of them offer internal OER grants to encourage the adoption, adaptation, or creation of OER. So we found that 19 institutions offer these types of grants, and that's based on those confirmed at the time of the environmental scan. We know of at least 2 more that are in the works. So the graph on this slide represents the institutions for which the grant amounts were specified. And there's a distinction being made here by the different amounts available depending on the type of activity. So adoption, adaptation, creation. There are 3 institutions that are not on the graph, the University of Calgary, the University of Saskatchewan, and Seneca College, because no amount was provided. But they do offer grants. Most of the institutions that offer internal OER grants are in British Columbia, so those are the ones appearing in orange. And that's followed by Alberta, the ones in green, in yellow, and then by Ontario, the ones that are in green. So of these 19 institutions, 16 are universities. The grant amounts vary from $800 to $25,000, with a median of $5,000 offered per project. Currently, UBC leads the way with its OER implementation grants of up to $25,000 over the life of the project, and that's up for 18 months. The amount, which probably is not a surprise, but the amounts for creation are usually highest, with the lowest amounts reserved for review and adoption of an OER. Other institutions redistribute funding that's provided by provincial governments or organizations. Some of them are in the works, for example, in Prince Edward Island. And that brings me to talking about the Atlantic region in particular. So what we're offering here for the next few slides are highlights from each region. So we're going to go from east to west. So in Atlantic Canada, there were a total of 34 institutions that were considered and 1 regional organization. In this case, it's the Council of Atlantic University Libraries. Most of the institutions are small to mid-range and usually undergraduate institutions. So from these 34 institutions, there were 34% of them, so 12 institutions that have some kind of OER involvement. The most common type of support that was found was educational support, so educational offering at 12 of those institutions. So providing education about OER, raising awareness about that, but also providing support in finding OER and also support with licensing. And that kind of support is often provided by the library. In terms of governance, it was found to be shared between the library and other units, although there was no discernible pattern in terms of who was leading between the library and other units. There were a few initiatives that we saw at Dalhousie. For example, at Dalhousie, it seemed to be more of based on faculty demand. And then at UPEI, the push was coming more from administrators and student organizations. But there's also initiatives at the Nova Scotia Community College. And those initiatives are about adapting open textbooks. And in particular, there's the example of the Open Textbook Initiative at UPEI, and that institution leads in that region with that initiative that started in 2012. And also UPEI has a cross-institutional working group about open textbooks. Some of the challenges that are listed here are also challenges that are found in some other regions. But in this case, what was noticed was there was a lack of financial incentivization, although there are definitely movements to change that. And also a lack of policy, especially at the provincial and institutional level. But also a lack of regional and provincial infrastructure to support the development of OER. And I mentioned the Council of Atlantic University Libraries before. So this particular group has included in the strategic plan, or making OER as part of their strategic plan. And the goal is to implement this regional infrastructure for open textbooks and some financial incentivization as well. So that brings me to Quebec. So for that province, there were 55 institutions and 4 organizations that were considered in the scan. Of the institutions, 16% of them, so 9 institutions, had some OER involvement. In terms of the language difference, so all of the Anglophone universities appear to be engaging in OER activities, whereas for Francophone universities, it was 31% of them. We also found that one collège or cégep engaged in OER activity, but as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't mean that there's nothing happening or not much happening in colleges or cégep in Quebec. It's really that there's more of a community of librarians and education professionals that are active in 3 organizations in order to implement an OER portal, for example. So those organizations are le Centre de documentation collégiale, Vitrine Technologie Éducation, and the Centre collégial de développement de matériel didactique. So they're working together rather than having a more institution-specific approach. Something else that was actually very important in the more recent movement for OER in Quebec is that the Quebec government adopted a 5-year digital action plan in June 2018, and that's really been that's been the impetus to create an eCampus Quebec, basically, but also to develop OER and to have a hosting platform in that province. And one of the most notable developments is that there's Université de Sherbrooke, Université de Montréal, and Université Laval, who basically joined forces to create la Fabrique de ressources éducatives libres, which has the goal of not just of creating OERs and making them available, not just in Quebec, but beyond in the rest of la francophonie as well. And people working on these include academic advisors, librarians, and other education professionals. So that brings me to an overview of what's happening more in the Francophone and bilingual institutions outside Quebec. So we found there were 16 institutions, and those are usually quite small. So for example, 9 of these institutions have 1,000 students or less. 6 of them have less than 10,000 students. And then there's the largest one, which is the University of Ottawa with over 40,000 students. So of these institutions, 31% were found to engage in some kind of OER activity. Of the institutions that are officially bilingual, there's 4 of them. So 3 out of those 4, 75%, have found to be engaging in OER activity. At the time of the scan, there was no concerted or sustained effort at adopting or adapting or creating OER in small colleges and universities that are serving a Francophone minority population outside of Quebec. So there's very small pockets of activities when we were looking, but there are things in development. For example, at University of Ottawa, there are some things that are underway, although they're not necessarily visible on our website. And one example of an OER activity that was found was at Université de Moncton in New Brunswick, where they offered a MOOC about OERs in 2014. And it was found that over 1,200 people had registered for this MOOC, but in the end, very few people had actually completed the course, and the project was later abandoned. But something that's been really a driving force in developing OERs in French outside of Quebec, especially, has been eCampus Ontario. So, for example, in 2017, their call for funding mentioned specifically the creation of original French content. In 2018, there was eCampus Ontario sponsored a one-day symposium on French OER in Ottawa. Then in the following year, so in March 2019, their open library became a bilingual platform. And that same month, they also hired a Francophone Initiatives Program Manager. And more recently, they have partnered with La Fabrique in Quebec, the group I was talking about a bit earlier, to provide training and to help develop some sprint activities. So that brings me to the question of language. So here are some observations. Of course, here we're talking about English and French, but in terms of it's clear that the vast majority of OERs in Canada are in English, and there's a gap in French language OER. But that's also true in terms of the gap. It would be also true for Indigenous languages, for example, and probably even more so. So there's a need to fill this gap. And that one-day symposium that I just referred to in Ottawa in 2018 started to address that. And it's true in Quebec and it's true in the rest of Canada. Some of the concerns about having this gap, or the concern of having this gap growing, is that it's not really addressing, if this disparity is not addressed, it could actually create a significant disincentive to study in French if studying in English becomes more affordable with more widespread integration of OER in that language. But that gap is also definitely an opportunity for Francophone and bilingual institutions. And having OER in French becomes an alternative to the limited availability of commercial materials in French. And also availability, but also affordability, because sometimes commercial textbooks that are available in French come from France, so ends up costing more, but also because the market is smaller, sometimes the costs are actually higher. So OER, and so creating OER in French might be a way to address this. And something to keep in mind, or something to consider, is that as more French OER are emerging, there's been the question about, well, is it enough to just translate what already exists in English or in adapting, or should there be a push for a culture of creation in French? And probably those two are a good idea, but it's something to keep in mind in terms of trying to fill that gap. So on this note, I will stop sharing my screen so my co-presenter Laurie can tell you more about Ontario.
So I am, as you can see, we're moving from east to west. So I'll start following Quebec with Ontario. So we looked at 46 institutions and 4 provincial organizations. looking over their websites and connecting with people where we could find someone identified, we could see that there are 48% have some sort of OER involvement. And looking deeper, we could see that over 80% of them had a guide of some sort. And oftentimes that guide, and the majority of the time, that guide was originating with the library. We also found that the colleges have centralized their guides and support, their online support and education through an OER toolkit that's part of their faculty toolkit platform, and that's shared across colleges. And in some cases, the colleges had their own. In other cases, they had their own and then linked out to the central OER toolkit. And then in some cases, they didn't have their own, they just linked out to the toolkit. And the toolkit is, if you have a chance to look at it, it's very extensive. We'll have more to say about that in the report. And much like other provinces and other institutions, the library is generally the lead, although there are teaching and learning units as well that will partner with libraries. So sometimes there's a bit of a combination. There are only a handful of internal funding opportunities. Ryerson and Seneca come to mind. But in part, that's because, as Melanie said, discussed about eCampus Ontario is really the main driver for funding for OER development. And so their mandate is funding to improve access to digital education and learning resources. Their recent report indicated that 81% of universities have received some sort of funding from eCampus Ontario, and 75% of colleges have received funding. So there is quite a bit happening in Ontario. And as Melanie said earlier on, it's really difficult sometimes to dig in and see exactly what's going on. And here's a good example of that is Terry Green, who is at Fleming College, and he has a podcast called Getting On Air, or Getting Air rather, and it discusses, he interviews and discusses technology enabled and open learning practices, and it's a really good podcast, but you wouldn't know anything about it that I could find anyways on the Fleming College website. And he's also the winner of an Open Education Award that was given out in 2019 in Milan, Italy. These are just some of the things that I've found just kind of digging in a little bit and looking a little further. So there's more that's, as we said, there's more than we know, and would really I'd be happy to see this crowdsourced a little bit and get a little bit more information. So moving on to the prairies. We looked at 48 institutions, 2 provincial organizations. So that's Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. 42% have some kind of OER involvement. And again, the library leads in about half those cases, and it's followed by teaching and learning centers. So that's not unusual. Again, it looks very similar to other provinces. Most of the universities in Alberta do offer grants for OER of some sort, and there was provincial funding at Regina and University of Saskatchewan to support an open textbook creation. Campus Alberta Open Education Open Resources Initiative awarded $1.7 million over 3 years to develop a common OER. And Athabasca hosts the UNESCO Commonwealth of Learning Chair in OER. SAIT adopted an OER policy. It was a board-approved OER policy and an open education strategic plan. And that's had impact on their funding, they've also provided some funding for the development of open educational resources as well. So that takes us over to British Columbia. And British Columbia is really, as stated earlier, is really leading the way in open education and open educational resources with 27 institutions and 1 provincial organization. 63% of them are involved in some kind of OER initiative. And often, again, libraries and teaching learning centers are responsible for together managing grants and projects. BC Campus, I don't think it's well known just how old it is, that it was established in 2003 and that in 2012 launched its open textbook and project, and that project awards grants and fellowships. And one of the outcomes of the OE movement in BC is the BC Open Education Librarian community, and that community has a website, and it connects librarians that are working in and are advocates for OER to share guides and documentation and be a community of practice for librarians in BC. Excuse me. And there's an active engagement of students in raising awareness of textbook costs and alternatives in BC, and many of us would be aware of that they've done the Textbook Broke campaign in BC, and also have surveyed students around their textbook use, and that's helped really broaden the conversation around the issue of the cost of textbooks and its impact on teaching and learning. A few highlights to spotlight about British Columbia. There are really 3 universities that are at the forefront. Kwetlen Polytechnic University is a leader in open textbook adoption. They are the first to come up with a 0 textbook cost program, so courses that where the material for the textbook material is open or no cost. They have a clear definition of what constitutes the 0 textbook cost, and in that case, in that definition, it also includes licensed material through library subscriptions in that 0 textbook cost program. And they're dedicated to the open education management. They have an open education management position in office, which is really, I get very excited when I think about what could be done with that kind of dedicated person. And they also have an open publishing site. University of British Columbia also is a leader in open education with an Open UBC website collecting institutional OE projects in access, research, and education. They had a recent implementation of OER funds, $250,000 annually over funding over 4 years. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of UBC from that influx of funds. And another interesting and really shaking the ground under the OER development and really changing the conversation is the recognition in their tenure and promotion for faculty for the educational leadership stream to recognize the development of OER for those faculty. And then we also have Camelson College, and BC Campus grant was given to the college to establish an open education demonstration initiative. And through that, they developed 10 courses using OER and OEP. And they also, as part of that project, are creating a course redesign handbook that will be shared with other institutions. And to date, there are 124 classes using open textbooks as a core resource. Moving on to the Northern region and Indigenous institutions, We looked at 22 institutions, with 2 of those institutions having OER related activities. And you can see those are listed there. Yukon College. So they have a basic OER guide and access to press books via BC Campus. And they provide support for creation of OERs with students. That's a specific fund that through their teaching and learning unit that provides that support. And an extensive portfolio of course syllabi that are open and released under Creative Commons license, which is just fabulous. I'm sure that we are all in envy of that. It would be wonderful to be able to see course syllabi released under Creative Commons. The other institution in the northern region is Muskous. I had this pronunciation, hang on. Muskousis Cultural College, my apologies to folks from that institution. It's a private Indigenous college in Alberta, and they received a grant from Campus Alberta to take courses in sociology and earth sciences and localize them and bring in more Indigenous knowledge into those courses. And they estimate that this initiative has saved students over $48,000 over 3 years. But sadly, one of the challenges for the North is, northern communities, is this lack of home internet and computer access. So that wraps up our environmental scan of the state of OER in Canada. Members of the Carl Open Education Environmental Scan Sub-Task Group, you can see are in front of your screen there. So does anybody have any questions?
Thanks so much, Melanie and Laurie. So I'm going to invite everyone, if you do have questions, to add them to the chat box. And I guess I'll start off if there are no other questions at this point. So I guess I was going to just ask, were there any major surprises coming out of this? Any projects or ideas for projects that you were not aware of that you're happy to have learned about?
That's a good question. I would say that maybe personally it was more, I was happy to learn about the developments in Quebec, because it really has the potential to be incredibly helpful for not just in Quebec, but elsewhere. So I knew a little bit about it, but through the research for an environmental scan, it sounded really encouraging.
I would say for myself, I'm excited for the report to come out and for the breadth of knowledge that I now have around just how much is happening across the country. I'm really excited to get that out there in front of people, because I think sometimes we hear about what's happening in BC because there's so much in eCampus Ontario, but then to find out that there are other provinces are doing very similar initiatives at a different scale or in different ways. That's been really exciting, and certainly I've already mentioned it, but the work that's being done at Fleming College, I know there's work being done there in OER. I didn't have just a amount of time, but the next thing I really want to do is reach out to Terry and find out more about what's going on. He works in there. He's an educational developer, and he's really doing great work. So that was one of those kind of highlights for me.
Thanks. I see that we have 3 questions in the chat box. So maybe we can start with Lindsay's question. She asks, I'm wondering if any analysis was done comparing OER activities between small and larger institutions.
No, but that's a good one. And maybe something that we might want to consider including in our report.
So following that up, is anyone aware of examples where work on OER is acknowledged and or valued in non-OER internal grants or opportunities, for examples, for supported leave?
I'm not sure if for a supported leave, I guess for in environments where you have the opportunity, a librarian has the opportunity to take an academic leave. I'm not sure that's what the question is referring to, but I can say for myself, that's exactly what I'm doing for 2020. I did apply for a leave to look at OER more deeply and really become the expert in my institution. I'm not sure if that's what she was asking.
I would say the other thing that I've seen, I mean, I haven't seen many, well, examples of that in the environmental scan itself. It's been more the opposite in the sense that, so maybe it does exist, but when you read about the internal grants, for example, they will say, well, one of the conditions is that this cannot be used to support a leave or something like that. So it's not like, are there other ways to support work on OER rather than grants? Possibly, but that kind of caveat or condition that's included when you apply for these grants, saying it can't be used for that, makes me hope that there are other ways that that the leave would be supported, but not through that, unfortunately.
So we have quite a few other questions coming in, which is great. So I'll just keep going through. I think the next one is a comment from Inba at University of Victoria, probably for addition into the report. And she says, at the University of Victoria, there's an internal research fund for creative products that can be used towards OER creation. And the next question from Isabelle Laplante. Since we talk about open resources, do we know if all OER are described in open metadata in repositories? I think that's a good question, probably beyond the scope of this project, but I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
I don't know.
It does sound like a good future project though.
Yeah,
Definitely.
And maybe something that I could bring up with the Carl Open Repositories Working Group, which is another group that talks a lot about metadata. So Lillian, I'm not exactly sure what she's responding to, but we are aware of work in progress in Ontario. So in terms of course leave, okay. So that might be of use to Dana. Dana, you may want to follow up with Lillian Hogendorn at eCampus Ontario. And a question, oh, and Carrie also has some information for Dana in the chat box. So Marilou has a question, and she asks, how many OER librarians are there in Canada? And she means librarians working only on OER projects.
I'm aware of 2.
A couple more, but there aren't too many. Marilou, I can look into that for you. We have quite a good list of people who are involved in open education, so I probably have some job titles. I can look into that for you if you're interested. So I see that Dana has added some extra detail about her question. She's interested in where OER may be spotlighted as a product or activity of broader grants, etc. So something, yes, to work on there. And I guess, yeah, the rest are some comments in response as well. Are there any other questions that people might have? I know we still have a bit of time because we started at 15:15, so nothing wrong with ending early either. If anybody else has questions, please go ahead. Or Laurie and Menini, if anything else has come to you based on some of these questions that you'd like to share.
Actually, I have a question for you. So it's more of a technical question. So the comments that are being added to the chat, are we going to be able to, because there's good information there, are we going to be able to record that somewhere or save it?
Yes, I'll give you a little bit of Zoom technical information, which is that I'm recording
Okay.
to the cloud, which means that when you record off Zoom to the cloud, it records the chat.
Beautiful.
There you go. Now you all know.
Thank you.
And I will mention that some of you are joining us in January. So January 27th and 28th for the Open Education Leadership Essentials, which is a 2-day workshop, which should be really, really fun and really interesting, and a great opportunity to get this burgeoning community of librarians involved in open education together. We're hoping it won't be the last time we host this. We hope it's just the first of many. But for those of you who aren't joining us, there will absolutely be, we'll be sharing some results and some information about that afterwards, what comes of it. I just wanted to mention that as well. But I do see, we have another question from Inba. Does the scope of the project include folks who are using library resources as part of zero cost for courses?
Well, there's two levels of to this. To my answer, I guess. The first one is at the level of the working group itself. We made a point to not specifically go into zero cost courses, and so using library resources which are affordable but not necessarily open. So we're not considering that. It's kind of out of scope for the working groups activities. In the scan, we do mention Quantlin because of being a leader in terms of zero cost courses, which is a combination of open educational resources, but other things such as, you know, leveraging the library resources. So because Quantlin is a leader in that, we've mentioned it, but it's not part of the scope of the working group's activities per se.
And another question here, any tips for subject librarians wanting to encourage faculty and or get involved?
I'll do another plug for the leadership event. One of the sessions is talking exactly about that question about advocacy, and that's myself and Ledbrook that'll be doing that. But I would, thinking about if I'm thinking from the perspective of faculty, I think one of the most compelling reasons is the control and the creativity and the intellectual freedom to develop your own content. It's a lot of work, but you're not faced with a textbook that you kind of like. You can use some of it, maybe not all of it, and then you're going to cobble together other bits from other sources. Oftentimes, depending on the discipline, there may not be a course that's specifically, or a text that's specific for the course. So I think that's one of the, compelling arguments that can motivate faculty.
Well, if that's the end of the questions, oh, of course it's not. Let's see, we have a comment from Caroline. We also created Opus to help faculty with converting their content. We found many of them had the material, but putting it in the open was their barrier. Once we said we would help them put it into something like Pressbooks, they were very pleased. It did mean some shuffling of workloads in the library. So yes, thanks, Caroline. Yes, that appears to be another tip for encouraging faculty.
Oh, and kind of a follow-up to that, because Carolyn's comment about Opus reminded me, I heard somewhere else at some point, I think it might be at La Cité Collégiale or Le Collège La Cité now. There was someone talked about how to approach faculty who are near retirement, well, not too close to retirement, still have a bit of time, because as was mentioned, they have a lot of content, they have a lot of material, and they don't necessarily know what to do with it. And that might be a way to approach, you know, faculty before their knowledge kind of disappears from the institution, and try to transform that into an OER of some sort.
It's a great idea.
Mm-hmm. Yep, Inbook agrees. All right, well, I think we will leave it at that for today. Thank you so much, Melanie and Laurie. That was really, really great. I think this is going to be an excellent resource once it's all put together. And I do agree with you, Laurie, that if we can do a crowdsourcing effort to get input on a draft and make sure that we're reflecting kind of a good current snapshot of what's going on, that would be really amazing. And I think we can make that work.
Wonderful.
All right. Thanks everyone for being here today.